World saw him as a billionaire, a man who had it all: power, wealth, and a life others could only dream of. His wedding was set to be the grandest event of the year, a spectacle of luxury and perfection. But as Ethan Carter stood at the altar, surrounded by flashing cameras and whispers of admiration, his eyes found Hurrien in the crowd. And in that single moment, everything he had built, everything he thought he wanted, began to crumble. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes love isn't lost. It's waiting for the right moment to change everything. Dear, beloved readers, whether you're here for the first time or returning to relive the emotions of Ethan Carter's journey, welcome to a world where love is greater than wealth, where second chances matter, and where hearts find their way back home. A special prayer for you. May your heart always recognize true love. May your soul never settle for less than it deserves. And may your life be filled with endless blessings, hope, and second chances. New here. Begin the journey from the very start and feel every emotion woven into Ethan and Lily's love story. Returning reader, your love for these characters keeps their story alive. Thank you for being part of this beautiful journey. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected with every twist, every heartfelt moment, and every lesson that love teaches. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter of Mr. Carter's world. Drop a comment below. Tell us, what part of Ethan and Lily's story touched your heart the most? Now, let the journey of love, redemption, and second chances begin. The grand hall shimmered like a dream, adorned with chandeliers that bathed the room in golden light. Rows of ivory roses lined the aisles, their delicate fragrance weaving through the air like a soft whisper of romance. Every detail of Ethan Carter's wedding was meticulously planned. Perfection in every petal, every golden-rimmed glass, every elegantly dressed guest who whispered in awe. The world was watching. Ethan Carter, the billionaire tech mogul, was about to marry Emily Lancaster, heiress to an empire of wealth and influence. It was the kind of wedding that filled the glossy pages of magazines, a spectacle of opulence and prestige. Celebrities graced the crowd, their designer attire gleaming beneath the crystal lights. Reporters hovered at the edges, cameras flashing like tiny explosions of artificial excitement. The business elite nodded in approval, recognizing the power this union represented. And yet, standing in the midst of it all, Ethan felt a hollowness in his chest, a quiet ache he couldn't name. He glanced at the towering floral arch beneath which he would soon say his vows, the soft melody of a string quartet filling the air. Emily, his soon-to-be wife, was everything society expected of him, graceful, poised, and every bit the queen to his empire. She had the perfect smile, the perfect upbringing, the perfect life. On paper, their match was flawless. So why did he feel like he was walking into a golden cage? His hands clenched at his sides as he forced himself to smile at the passing guests. Everyone assumed he was the luckiest man alive. After all, he had everything: wealth beyond measure, a business empire that had conquered the world, and now a wife whose name would cement his legacy. But as the minutes ticked closer to the ceremony, his pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with unease. Something was missing, something important, something his wealth, success, and power could never replace. And for the first time in years, as he stood at the altar waiting for his bride, Ethan Carter felt the heavy weight of regret pressing against his heart. Years ago, before the world knew his name, before billions filled his bank account, and before power consumed his every decision, Ethan Carter had loved with the purest, most untainted part of his heart. Her name was Lily. She wasn't a woman of wealth or status. She didn't come from a world of extravagant galas or business empires. But what she lacked in riches, she made up for in kindness, warmth, and a love so unwavering that it once felt like the only thing he ever needed. Back when he was just a young man with dreams too big for his pockets, Lily had been his light in the darkness. She had seen the fire in his eyes before anyone else did. While the world doubted him, she had believed. While he worked endless nights in a cramped apartment, trying to build something out of nothing, she had sat beside him, bringing him coffee, whispering words of encouragement, kissing away his exhaustion. "I don't need you to be rich, Ethan," she had once told him with a soft smile. "I just need you to be happy." At the time, he thought happiness meant success. So when the day came, the day his company finally took off, when investors flooded in, when money and power became his reality, he convinced himself that love no longer fit into the equation. Lily was not from his world of polished suits and high-stakes deals. She didn't belong in the grand vision he had crafted for his future. And so, in a moment of cruel finality, he let her go. He remembered that night vividly, the way her eyes, once filled with so much love, had shimmered with disbelief and heartbreak. She had held his hands, pleading with him to reconsider, to remember that love was not a burden but a gift. But he had steeled his heart, turning his back on the one person who had ever truly known him. "It's better this way," he had told himself. And for years he believed it. Until now. Until this moment, standing at the altar, dressed in the finest suit money could buy, about to marry a woman the world deemed perfect for him, yet feeling more lost than he had ever been. Because no matter how much success he had achieved, no matter how high he had climbed, there was one thing his wealth could never buy back: Lily. And the love he had so carelessly thrown away. The air in the grand hall felt heavy, thick with expectation. Ethan stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, his pulse hammering beneath the surface of his composed exterior. The whispers had settled. The music played in delicate waves, signaling the arrival of his bride. Emily would walk down the aisle any moment now, her gown flowing like liquid silk, her steps as graceful as ever. And yet Ethan's mind felt distant, adrift, as though his soul had stepped away from his body. His eyes, restless and searching, scanned the sea of expectant faces in the audience. That was when he saw her. A single moment, a single heartbeat, a single look. Lily. Time crashed to a halt, his breath caught in his throat, his heart missing a beat before slamming back to life in a painful, aching rhythm. She was there, among the hundreds of guests sitting in quiet elegance, her presence blending into the crowd yet standing out like a beacon in a storm. The years had changed her, but in the most beautiful ways. Her features were softer yet stronger. Her eyes still held the depth of emotion he once drowned in. But now they carried something else, something distant, unreadable. She wasn't the young woman who had once held on to him with innocent love. She was different now, poised, composed, radiant in a way that made his chest tighten. For a moment he wondered if he was hallucinating. Maybe it was his guilt, manifesting in the form of the woman he had abandoned. But no, she was real, too real. And then, as if sensing his stare, Lily's gaze lifted. Their eyes met. A silent collision, a war of unspoken words. And suddenly Ethan wasn't in the grand wedding hall anymore. He wasn't a billionaire standing at the altar, about to pledge himself to another woman. He was just a man staring at the love he had once lost. A man who, for the first time in years, felt the weight of regret crash over him like an unforgiving tide. The carefully built walls around his heart began to crumble. The empire he had sacrificed so much for, the very life he had chosen, suddenly felt unbearably empty. Lily's lips curved into a polite, unreadable smile. But her eyes held a story he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. And yet, he knew. This moment, this single glance, had already changed everything. The moment their eyes met, the past came rushing back like a tidal wave, drowning Ethan in memories he had spent years locking away. Lily's laughter, soft and melodic, the kind that could turn even his darkest days into light. He remembered the way she used to tilt her head back when she laughed too hard, her whole body shaking as if joy was something she truly lived, not just felt. He had loved that about her. the way she had believed in him when no one else did, when his dreams were nothing but scribbles in a notebook, when failure seemed inevitable, when he doubted himself more than anyone else. "You're going to change the world, Ethan," she had whispered one night, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his palm as they lay on the old couch in his tiny apartment. "And when you do, don't forget the man you are now." But he had forgotten. The memory shifted, and suddenly he was reliving the night he walked away. It had been raining. He still remembered the scent of wet pavement, the way the cold droplets clung to their skin, how the streetlights cast a golden glow on Lily's tear-streaked face. "Please," she had begged, her hands gripping his. "Ethan, we can make this work. We always have." But he had pulled away. "This isn't about love, Lily," he had said, his voice cold, distant, so unlike the man who had once sworn to love her forever. "This is about my future." Her breath had hitched, as if he had struck her. "And I'm not a part of that." He had hesitated. For a split second, he had wanted to take it all back, to tell her she was his future. But his ambition, his hunger for success, had drowned out the voice of his heart. "I can't do this," he had said instead. "I can't afford distractions." Distraction. That was what he had called her. The look in her eyes that night had haunted him for years. The way her shoulders had sagged in defeat, the way her lips had parted as if to say something, anything, but no words had come. And now, as she sat before him in the grand wedding hall, that same look lingered beneath her polite smile. A quiet sadness, a pain she had long since learned to carry with grace. Ethan's chest tightened, his hands curled into fists. He had chosen power over love. He had convinced himself that wealth and status would be enough. But standing at the altar, staring at the woman he had once destroyed, he finally understood the truth. He had gained everything, and lost the only thing that ever mattered. The walls of the grand hall seemed to close in around him. The weight of 1,000 expectant eyes bore down on Ethan, but all he could feel was the crushing weight inside his chest. His breath grew shallow. His gaze flickered to Emily, standing just beyond the aisle, her veil cascading down like a silken river. She was stunning, a vision of perfection, every inch the bride the world expected for a man like him. But all he could see was Lily. All he could feel was the gnawing ache of everything he had abandoned, the life he had built, the billions in his accounts, the sprawling offices bearing his name, the exclusive circles that now welcomed him as one of their own. None of it mattered in this moment. The empire he had sacrificed so much for now felt like a hollow shell, a gilded prison trapping a man who had once dreamed of more than just success. His hands trembled. His legs refused to move. For the first time in his life, Ethan Carter felt powerless. The altar, which had once symbolized the pinnacle of his achievements, now felt suffocating. The walls of the cathedral loomed around him like a cage, the weight of his choices pressing against his ribs until he could barely breathe. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Cameras flashed. Emily took a step forward, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching her bouquet a little tighter. "Ethan," she whispered, a frown forming between her brows. But he couldn't speak. His entire life flashed before him, the moments of triumph, the victories, the carefully cultivated image of a man who had it all. And yet, as he stood there, drowning in the sight of Lily's unreadable gaze, he had never felt emptier. A realization struck him like a thunderbolt. He had spent years chasing something he thought would bring him happiness, only to realize, too late, that he had left his true happiness behind. His heart pounded like a drum of war. What had he done? What had he lost? The unbearable weight of regret settled over him, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter, the man who had built an empire from nothing, didn't know what to do. The grand hall fell into an expectant silence. The priest's voice echoed softly, steady and rehearsed, calling Ethan to speak his vows. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. The cameras were rolling, the guests sat in hushed anticipation, and Emily stood before him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. but Ethan couldn't move. His mouth opened, but no words came. His throat felt dry, constricted by something far heavier than nerves. His heart pounded like a war drum, each beat screaming a truth he had spent years trying to silence. His silence stretched too long. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like a rising tide. Emily's brows furrowed, her perfect composure wavering for the first time. She leaned in, her voice low and urgent. "Ethan, what's wrong?" Wrong. Everything was wrong. This wedding, this life, this version of himself, none of it felt real anymore. None of it felt like the future he had once dreamed of. His eyes drifted past Emily, past the sea of elegantly dressed guests until they found her. Lily. She sat still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, held the weight of a history that no one else in this room understood. And suddenly nothing else mattered. Not the wealth, not the expectations, not the flashing cameras, only her. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His pulse was a wildfire, burning through his chest with the force of every regret he had buried. He had spent years convincing himself that love was secondary, that ambition was all he needed. But looking at Lily now, seeing the quiet strength in her gaze, Ethan knew he had been wrong. Painfully, devastatingly wrong. The murmurs in the hall grew louder. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. Emily's grip on his hands tightened. "Ethan," she hissed under her breath, her voice laced with confusion and growing panic. "Say something." But he couldn't, because in that moment, Ethan Carter knew. If he spoke now, if he uttered words he didn't mean, if he stepped forward and said vows that belonged to someone else, he would be sealing his fate in a life that wasn't truly his. And for the first time in years, he refused to let that happen. A single step, then another. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his choices had settled onto his shoulders all at once. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, shocked whispers blending into a symphony of disbelief. Gasps echoed through the grand hall as Ethan descended the altar, not toward Emily, the woman he was supposed to marry, but toward the one woman he could never forget. Lily. The cameras flashed in rapid succession, capturing every second of his betrayal. Journalists clutched their notepads, their minds already crafting the scandal that would dominate headlines by morning. Emily's parents shot to their feet, their expressions a mix of fury and humiliation. Emily herself stood frozen, gripping her bouquet so tightly her knuckles turned white. But Ethan didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't care. His polished shoes barely made a sound against the marble floor as he crossed the distance between them, the elegant decorations and sparkling chandeliers blurring into insignificance. His world had narrowed to a single point. To her. Lily sat motionless, poised yet unreadable. The years had refined her, sculpted her into someone stronger, more resilient. She no longer looked like the girl who had once pleaded with him in the rain, begging him to choose love over ambition. She looked like a woman who had learned to live without him, but her eyes, those same deep, expressive eyes, held something else, something he couldn't name. Finally, he stopped in front of her. His chest rose and fell with the force of his ragged breath. His fingers curled into fists at his sides as he struggled to find his voice. And then, finally, the words came. "Why are you here?" A single question, but it carried a world of meaning. Why had she come? Was it to watch him marry another woman? To remind him of what he had lost? To prove that she had moved on, that she no longer waited for him? Lily inhaled softly, tilting her head ever so slightly. She could have said 1,000 things. She could have unleashed years of heartbreak, could have thrown his regrets back in his face, but she didn't. Instead, she met his gaze with quiet strength, her voice steady and distant. "Because I wanted to see the man you became." The words struck him harder than he was prepared for. He swallowed, his throat tight. Because buried beneath her calm tone was the truth that shattered him more than any accusation ever could. She wasn't here to take him back. She wasn't here to stop the wedding. She was here to see if the man standing before her was still the same one who had once walked away. And in that moment, Ethan wasn't sure he liked the answer. Ethan's breath hitched as the weight of Lily's words crashed over him. The air in the grand hall grew impossibly thick, suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. His heart pounded, the rhythm uneven, frantic, like a man running toward something he feared was already lost. Tears burned in his eyes, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. He had spent years chasing power, wealth, status, believing that success was the answer, that ambition would fill the void inside him. But standing here now, face to face with the woman he had abandoned, he knew the truth. "I became rich," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "I became powerful, but I lost the only thing that ever mattered. You." Lily's breath caught. For the briefest moment, her composure wavered. But then she straightened, her fingers tightening in her lap. She didn't look away, didn't rush to comfort him. Instead, she met his gaze with quiet, unwavering strength. "It wasn't your success that took you away, Ethan," she said softly, but there was no softness in her words, only truth. "It was your choice." A sharp, invisible knife sliced through his chest. Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. That was what hurt the most. She wasn't trying to punish him. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was simply stating a fact. And for the first time, Ethan saw himself through her eyes. Not as the billionaire, not as the celebrated CEO, not as the man the world revered, but as the man who had walked away. No excuses, no justifications. His choice. His lips parted, but nothing came out. Because what could he possibly say? That he had been young? That he had been blinded by ambition? That he had thought he was doing what was best for both of them? None of it mattered. None of it changed the reality of what he had done. He had left her. And now, standing before her with everything he had ever wanted, he had never felt emptier. A hollow, aching silence stretched between them, drowning out the gasps and whispers of the watching crowd. Ethan's hands trembled at his sides, his entire world unraveling in the span of a single moment, because for the first time in his life, he understood. Success had never been the answer. Love had been, and he had thrown it away. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. The weight of the moment, of the decision he was about to make, pressed against his chest like an iron vice. He turned slowly, deliberately back toward Emily. She stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly around the bouquet that her knuckles turned white. The elegant lace of her wedding gown shimmered under the golden lights, but her face, her expression, wasn't that of a bride on the happiest day of her life. It was one of a woman who already knew what was coming, a woman who had perhaps always known. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart thundering with the weight of a choice that had been years in the making. For the first time in his life, he spoke not as a billionaire, not as a man molded by expectations, but as the person he had buried beneath ambition, as a man who had finally found his truth. "I'm sorry, Emily." His voice was steady even as his chest ached. He took a slow breath. "I can't marry you." The hall erupted in chaos, gasps, murmurs. A flurry of whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. The camera zoomed in, capturing the moment that would be replayed across every news outlet by morning. Emily didn't move. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, blinking as if trying to process his words, to make sense of the disaster unraveling before her. Then, ever so slowly, her grip on the bouquet loosened. Her lips parted, but no words came. And then, her expression shifted. Not rage, not shock, but something far worse. Understanding. A bitter smile curled at the corners of her lips, masking the raw humiliation in her eyes. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head once as though she had always expected this moment to come. And perhaps, deep down, she had. "Then go to her," she said, her voice quiet but firm, controlled. But then her gaze sharpened. a flash of something unreadable crossing her face. "But don't expect her to take you back." Ethan flinched, the words slicing deeper than he thought possible. Because she was right. Lily was not the same woman he had walked away from years ago, and there was no guarantee she would ever let him back in. But for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter was willing to fight for something other than power. He was willing to fight for love. The room was still in chaos. Murmurs, gasps, the clicking of cameras capturing every moment of the disaster that had unfolded. But for Ethan, there was only Lily. She sat there, poised, unreadable, the weight of the years between them pressing down on them like an invisible force. His heart pounded. His entire life had been about control, about strategy, about knowing the outcome before making a move. But this was the most uncertain moment of his life, and the most important. He took a slow step forward, his breath uneven. "Please, tell me I still have a chance." The words came out rough, desperate, but honest. For the first time, Ethan Carter wasn't offering deals, promises, or grand gestures. He was simply a man asking the woman he loved if there was still hope. Lily's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. For a long, excruciating moment, she just looked at him, through him. He could see the storm in her eyes, the pain, the memories, the pieces of her heart he had shattered when he chose ambition over love. But what stunned him most wasn't the pain. It was the strength. She wasn't the girl who had once clung to his hand, begging him to stay. She wasn't the girl who had cried as he walked away, believing he needed success more than he needed her. She had survived. She had built a life without him, and she wasn't about to throw it away just because he had finally realized his mistake. Lily exhaled softly, her voice steady, but not unkind. "Ethan," she hesitated, but only for a second. "I loved you once, but I learned to live without you." The words landed like a punch to his gut. Ethan's chest tightened, his pulse hammering as if his heart itself was protesting her words. But she wasn't done. "I built myself up after you left," she continued, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not the same girl who waited for you." The finality in her tone sent a chill through him. She wasn't saying these words to hurt him. She was saying them because they were true, because she had changed, because she had grown, because she had learned to stand on her own, to be whole without him. And as much as it terrified him, it also made him love her even more. Lily wasn't his to claim anymore. She was her own. And if he wanted a place in her life again, he would have to earn it. Ethan had spent years building an empire, making ruthless decisions, winning battles in boardrooms that few could even dream of entering. But this was the hardest fight of his life. Because Lily wasn't a business deal to be negotiated. She wasn't a prize to be won with wealth or power. She was a woman who had loved him once, and who had learned to live without him. And if he wanted even the smallest place in her life again, he had to earn it. So for months, Ethan did what he had never done before. He waited, he listened, he showed up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, consistent love. He learned that Lily had built something beautiful, a charity for underprivileged children, a cause that had given her purpose when her heart was broken. So he volunteered, not as a billionaire donating a check, but as a man willing to work. He spent nights helping at soup kitchens, mornings reading to children at her foundation, weekends organizing fundraisers, not because he thought it would make her love him again, but because he wanted to be the kind of man who deserved her love. At first, Lily kept her distance. She watched him carefully, unsure if this was just another elaborate display, another performance by a man who once valued ambition more than emotions. But time passed, and Ethan didn't waver. He didn't try to impress her with luxury. He didn't push. He simply stayed. One evening, as she walked into the small community center she had built, she found him sitting on the floor surrounded by children, reading a story with a boy curled up against his side, and something in her chest shifted. This wasn't the Ethan she had known years ago. This wasn't the man who had left her behind, blinded by power and greed. This was someone else, someone humbled, someone luxcoto wiser. And despite every wall she had carefully built around her heart, she realized that this was the Ethan she had always believed he could be. And for the first time in years, Lily felt something she never thought she would again: hope. The world had given Ethan Carter everything: wealth, power, influence. But now it was turning against him. Lily scrolled through her phone, her heart sinking with every headline. Billionaire Ethan Carter's darkest secret exposed. Was his success built on betrayal? The man who walked away from love and ethics. Her hands trembled as she read. It wasn't just about Ethan. Her name was in the articles too. Lily Moore, the woman who took back a billionaire, but at what cost? Her charity, the foundation she had built with years of hard work and sacrifice, was being dragged into the chaos. People were questioning her integrity, wondering if she was using Ethan's wealth to fund her dreams. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. Rumors didn't need truth to destroy lives. The door to her small office swung open, and there he stood, Ethan, looking worn, exhausted. The usual confidence in his stride was gone. He had faced boardrooms full of ruthless CEOs, conquered industries, and built an empire. But standing in front of Lily, he looked like a man afraid of losing the only thing that truly mattered. Lily, his voice was hoarse, his eyes pleading. I didn't want you to find out like this. She set her phone down. So it's true? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. It's not as simple as they're making it seem. Years ago, when my company was still small, I made a decision, a bad one. A deal that helped me rise, but at the cost of people who trusted me. Lily swallowed hard. And you never told me? His shoulders sagged. Because I was ashamed. Because I wanted to be better when I stood in front of you again. But the past doesn't disappear just because we want it to. Silence hung between them. Lily searched his face for deception, but found none. Just regret. People are turning against you, Ethan, she whispered, and they're dragging my charity down with them. His jaw tightened. I will fix this. I'll protect you. She shook her head. This isn't about me needing protection. It's about knowing who you really are. Do you regret what you did, or do you just regret getting caught? His breath hitched. I regret everything. The choices I made, the people I hurt, but most of all, I regret that the man who did those things was the same man who once walked away from you. Lily closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the storm raging between love and betrayal. She had fought so hard to heal. Could she really stand by him when the world was tearing him apart? Ethan took a step closer, his voice trembling. Tell me what to do, Lily. If walking away is what you need, I'll do it. But if there's even a small part of you that still believes in me, I swear, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm not that man anymore. A tear slipped down her cheek. The world outside was screaming for his downfall. But in this moment, it wasn't about the world. It was about them. And love, the real kind, was never built on perfection. Lily inhaled sharply. I don't know if I can forget your past, Ethan. But if you truly want to change, then show me. Not with words, not with promises. With actions. His chest rose with relief, but he didn't move to touch her. Because this time he knew. This time he had to earn her. The candle flickered between them, casting soft shadows across the small table. The scent of home-cooked pasta filled the air, and the quiet hum of the city beyond Lily's apartment window was the only sound accompanying their silence. Lily watched Ethan, his gaze fixed on his untouched plate. His shoulders were tense, his phone face down beside him, but she could see the way his fingers twitched, aching to pick it up. You can check it, she said softly, breaking the stillness. Ethan's eyes snapped up, guilt flashing across his face. Number, this is our time. I promised. Lily exhaled, setting her fork down. Ethan, it's okay. I know your world doesn't stop just because you're here. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. But it should. You deserve my full attention. Then give it to me, she whispered, not out of guilt, out of choice. The weight of her words settled between them. Ethan reached for her hand, tracing his thumb over her skin. I don't want to lose you again, Lily. But I don't know how to be the man who runs an empire and the man who sits at this table without letting one consume the other. She studied him carefully. You're used to power, Ethan. To control. But love isn't a business deal. It's not something you can schedule between board meetings or fit into a 5-year plan. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. And your world, it's so different from mine. It is, she admitted. And I won't pretend it's easy watching you constantly torn between your company and us. But I also don't expect you to become someone you're not. Silence. Ethan hesitated before speaking, his voice raw. What if I don't know how to find the balance? What if love isn't enough? Lily's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his tone. Love is the foundation, she murmured. But it's not the whole house. We have to build it, brick by brick, with patience, compromise, and trust. Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her, as if memorizing every piece of the woman who had once been his past and now stood at the crossroads of his future. And if I fail? He asked. She squeezed his hand. Then we learn, together. His phone buzzed against the table. Ethan glanced at it, then back at Lily. Slowly, he reached out. Not for the phone, but for his fork. He took a bite of the now cold pasta, a small smile forming. For tonight, he said, my world is here. Lily smiled back. Maybe love wasn't enough on its own. But if they were willing to fight for it, to how choose gives each other despite their differences, maybe, just maybe, it would be everything. The storm didn't come all at once. It started as whispers in boardrooms, quiet doubts among investors, subtle shifts in stock prices. A few canceled meetings, then a postponed contract. Small things, barely noticeable at first. Then, the headlines hit. Billionaire Ethan Carter's company under investigation. Former fiancé reveals startling truth. Did he build his empire on lies? Lily Moore, the woman who stole a billionaire and destroyed his legacy. Double asterisk. Lily sat frozen in front of her laptop, her heart pounding as she read the latest accusations. Emily's father, a man with connections in every elite circle, had pulled strings, launching investigations into Ethan's business. Old business rivals had come forward with allegations of fraud, and anonymous sources had leaked stories that painted Ethan as a ruthless, unethical billionaire. And then there was her name. Dragged through the mud, labeled a gold digger, accused of manipulating Ethan into leaving Emily at the altar. Lily's hands trembled as she slammed the laptop shut. The air felt too thick, her lungs struggling to take in enough breath. Her phone rang. She barely managed to whisper, Ethan, I'm on my way. His voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the barely contained rage beneath it. Minutes later, he was at her door. His usual composed exterior was shattered. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled, his eyes was burning. She did this, he growled, pacing her small living room. Emily, her father. They're trying to destroy everything. Lily swallowed hard. Ethan, your company? Forget my company. He cut in, turning to face her. They're attacking EU. She lifted her chin, forcing her voice to stay steady. I can handle it. His hands curled into fists. You shouldn't have told to. Lily exhaled, stepping closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Ethan, We knew this wouldn't be easy. We knew there would be people, powerful people, who wouldn't accept us. His chest rose and fell, his anger barely restrained. She wants me to break, to run back to her, beg for her father's influence to make this all go away. Lily's heart clenched. And will you? His head snapped up, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Are you serious? She was a part of your world, Ethan. I never was. If she can give you back everything they're trying to take from you. His hands grasped her shoulders, firm but gentle, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Nothing matters if I lose you. Do you hear me, Lily? Tears burned at the edges of her vision. But what if you lose everything else? He took her face in his hands, his voice rough with emotion. Then I'll build it again. But this time, with you. A single tear escaped down her cheek, and he caught it with his thumb. The world outside was ruthless, filled with betrayal and greed. But here, in this moment, they were unbreakable. Let Emily come. Let the world judge them. Because love, real, unstoppable love, was worth every battle. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but Ethan's gaze was fixed only on the woman beside him. Lily stood under the old oak tree, their oak tree, the same one where years ago they had shared whispered dreams beneath the stars. This place held their past. Tonight it would shape their future. Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing over the small, simple object inside. No diamond, no grand gesture, just a promise. Lily turned to him, her eyes filled with quiet wonder. Why did you bring me here, Ethan? He exhaled, stepping closer. Because this is where I fell in love with you, where you made me believe I could do anything, where before I had wealth, before I had power, I had you, and I should have never let you go. Her lips parted slightly, as if his words had stolen the breath from her lungs. I wanted to ask you here, he continued, voice thick with emotion, because I don't want our love to be wrapped in luxury or status. I don't want it to be about rings or grand weddings. I just want you. Every messy, beautiful, stubborn part of you. He knelt down, not with an extravagant diamond, but with a simple, delicate bracelet made of intertwined silver strands. This was my mother's, he whispered. She always told me that love isn't measured by how much you spend, but by how much you give of yourself. Tears welled in Lily's eyes as she looked at the bracelet, then back at him. I don't need a perfect wedding, he said, his voice barely above a breath. I need a lifetime with you. A single tear escaped down her cheek, but her smile, radiant, unshaken, was what made Ethan's heart pound. Then, to his shock, Lily laughed. A soft, joyful sound that made the stars seem dim in comparison. Ethan, she whispered, reaching into her own pocket. Before I answer you, I have something to tell you. His brows furrowed in confusion as she pulled out a small envelope and handed it to him. With slightly trembling fingers, he opened it, his eyes scanning the words on the folded paper. Then he froze. He looked up at her, wide-eyed, his breath hitching. Lily, is this? She nodded, biting her lip as more tears slipped free. I found out last week. Inside the envelope was a sonogram. Ethan's hands shook as he traced the blurry image of their child. Emotion crashed over him like a tidal wave. He swallowed hard, his vision blurring as he stared at Lily, who was now laughing through her tears. I was going to tell you, she murmured, but I needed to know that you were choosing me, not out of obligation, but out of love. Ethan surged forward, lifting her into his arms as he buried his face in her neck, his shoulders shaking. You have always been my choice, Lily, always. He pulled back, framing her face in his hands, his forehead resting against hers. I love you, he breathed. I love both of you. A sob escaped her lips, and she nodded, her hands clutching his shirt as if afraid to let go. And then, with a radiant smile, She whispered the only answer that mattered. Yes, Ethan. A lifetime with you is all I want too. The stars above them burned brighter, but nothing could outshine the love between them. The walls of Ethan Carter's empire were crumbling. The numbers didn't lie. His CFO had laid it out in brutal detail. The company was bleeding millions, and if he didn't act fast, everything he had built would be gone. Ethan sat in his office staring out at the skyline, but for the first time the city lights brought him no comfort. His phone buzzed relentlessly, investors demanding answers, board members panicking, reporters waiting to devour the news. He was losing everything. But as the weight of the crisis bore down on him, the only thing that truly scared him was the thought of losing her. That evening, he found Lily sitting on the porch of their modest home. Their home, the one she had chosen when they decided to step away from the chaos of his billionaire world. She looked up as he approached, her eyes soft but searching. He hesitated, then sat beside her, running a hand through his hair. It's bad, Lily. His voice was raw, heavy with exhaustion. Worse than I thought. She didn't flinch. How bad? He exhaled. I might have to sell everything. The penthouse, the cars, maybe even the company itself. He turned to her, his throat tight. Lily, I won't be a billionaire anymore. I won't even be close. Silence stretched between them. Then she simply asked, And? His brows furrowed. And that changes everything. She tilted her head, a small, almost amused smile touching her lips. Ethan, did you really think I fell in love with you because of your wealth? His chest ached at the sincerity in her voice. No, he whispered, but I never wanted to give you less than everything. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You are everything, Ethan. His breath caught. I didn't love you because you were a billionaire, she continued, squeezing his hand gently, and I won't stop loving you because you aren't. Emotion surged in his throat, thick and overwhelming. Lily, she smiled softly, do you remember what you once told me? Under the oak tree? He swallowed hard, nodding. I don't want a perfect wedding. I want a lifetime with you. She cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek. You promised me a lifetime, Ethan. Not luxury, not wealth. Just you. And that's all I ever wanted. For the first time in weeks, something inside him broke free. The fear, the doubt, the weight of expectations, all of it faded as he realized something profound. He hadn't lost everything. He had saved the one thing that mattered most. Pulling her into his arms, he buried his face in her hair, holding her as if she was his entire world. Because she was. And in that moment, Ethan Carter understood something money could never teach him. Love wasn't about what you had. It was about who stood beside you when you had nothing. The world expected grandeur. After all, Ethan Carter was still a name that carried weight, even if he no longer lived in the billionaire spotlight. The media had been waiting for his next move, for him to reclaim his throne. His family expected a wedding that would rival royalty, a lavish spectacle, glittering with wealth and status. But Ethan and Lily wanted none of it. Standing in their small, sunlit kitchen, Ethan watched as Lily flipped through a simple wedding planner, her fingers tracing over pages filled with modest venues, handwritten vows, and wildflower bouquets. She looked up at him, uncertainty in her eyes. Are you sure about this? No cameras, no extravagant reception, no designer suits? He took her hands in his. I've never been more sure of anything. But the world wasn't ready to let them go so easily. His mother's voice was sharp over the phone. Ethan, this is absurd. You're a Carter. A wedding like this, it's beneath you. He sighed, pressing his fingers against his temple. Mom, it's not about the wedding, it's about Lily and me. Then give her something worthy of your name, she snapped. The country club is ready to host. I have the guest list. A wedding like yours should be a wedding like mine, he interrupted, voice firm, should be what Lily and I want, not what society expects. Silence. Then, in a cooler tone, she said, "You're throwing away a legacy for a love story." Ethan smiled. Maybe love is the only legacy that really matters. The day arrived. There was no grand ballroom, no glittering chandeliers, no flashing cameras. Instead, beneath the oak tree, where Ethan had first promised Lily a lifetime, they stood hand in hand. Only a handful of loved ones surrounded them. True friends, not business partners, family who cared, not socialites who judged. Lily's dress was simple, flowing like a soft whisper in the wind. Ethan wore a suit that wasn't designer, but it was his. The ring he placed on her finger wasn't the biggest, but it carried the weight of his heart. And when he said, "I do," he wasn't just making a vow. He was making a choice to love, not to impress, a choice to cherish, not to display, a choice to build a marriage, not just a wedding. As they kissed beneath the branches of their past, their future finally began, free from expectations, rich in the only thing that ever truly mattered: love. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn as the leaves whispered in the wind. The world had moved forward, yet here, beneath the old oak tree where two hearts had once dreamed together, time seemed to stand still. Lily stood there, arms crossed, watching Ethan as he took a deep breath. He looked different, not in the way money could change a man, but in the way regret, growth, and love could. This was the place where they had once planned a future, the place where he had promised her forever before walking away in pursuit of something he thought mattered more. But now he was here, not with riches, not with extravagance, but with humility. Slowly he sank to one knee. Lily's breath hitched, but there was no velvet box in his hands, no sparkling diamond worth millions, just him, a man stripped of everything except his love for her. "I don't want a perfect wedding," Ethan said, his voice raw with emotion. "I want a lifetime with you." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, because this time there was no illusion of fairy tales, no promises built on fleeting moments. This time it was real. This time she believed him. She reached for his hands, pulling him to his feet, and in that moment, as she embraced him, the past and present wove together like the branches above them, stronger, unbreakable. And as the world watched, the media, the critics, the people who once measured love by wealth, they saw something they couldn't ignore: that love isn't found in luxury. It isn't about status or power. It's about choices, respect, and second chances. And in the end, love won over materialism. The end.